Good afternoon. Let's begin this afternoon with a silent prayer. Thank you. Welcome this afternoon to the 32nd edition of the Leadership Chair. I'd like to welcome first, before we begin this session, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome the presence of our Vice Chancellor, Father Abraham, our Registrar, Dr. Anil Pinto, Deans, Directors, Heads of Departments, Coordinators, all of us here at Christ University who contribute towards the leadership of this large university and large, cosmic force that we have become. But today, to speak to us on a very interesting area, something which is very close to our hearts, especially those of us who belong to the schools of arts and humanities across the university, is Dr. John Joseph Kennedy speaking on a topic which is dear to his heart and entirely from lived experience, I'd like to say. He's going to be speaking on fostering humanistic leadership at universities, why and how. To briefly introduce, it's always ironic that speakers who don't deserve, who don't require, not deserve, sorry, don't require any introduction. Of course, he deserves a very warm introduction. Mr. Kennedy, please, no, it wasn't a Freudian slip. Sorry, you deserve many introductions, but you don't require an introduction at all. But because you don't require one, you have plenty that I can say about you. Yes, caught me off guard. Anyway, to get back to what I was saying, let me begin with my own recollection of the day I first walked into this university. I came for the FTP. Those days we used to go outside the campus, and I had only met Mr. Kennedy at my interview, so I knew that the name was unusual. I reported for duty and I asked for Mr. Kennedy, and I was told, "I am Mr. Kennedy. Who are you?" And it was quite a bewildering experience for someone as new as I was. It was Mr. Kennedy Thomas who had, Andrew Thomas, who had approached. And he told me, "You mean your boss, that is John Joseph Kennedy?" I said, "Oh, I didn't know there were two." And then I found my way to Dr. Kennedy. And it was really fascinating. I was just telling him that one can actually study the growth of the school and the university itself if you study Mr. Kennedy's own journey as a leader, from coordinator and head of the Department of English and Media Studies, where I came in. And it was a brilliant experience working with him. I don't think there's anyone in the School of Arts and Humanities who will have a different opinion, that we all feel encouraged, nourished, and really, he's got our backs. So we can experiment, we can do a lot of things, and he's always there, to cheer us on, occasionally raise a disapproving eyebrow at us. And, somehow that seems to be the way to work with people who are creative by disposition. And therefore, it was with much joy when Sam asked me about this, when I saw the title, Fostering Humanistic Leadership in Universities. It was really exciting. We've had many conversations at various levels. And so I'll hand over the floor to Mr. Kennedy before I make any more faux pas. And all the best, Mr. Kennedy.
So thank you, Dr. Shobna, for those warm words of introduction. I hope I'm audible to everybody. So good evening to all my dear colleagues. And as you all know, this is the topic that I'm going to discuss with you. More than discussion, it's sharing of my own experiences. And as pointed out by Dr. Shobna, it's been a long journey here at Christ. My first job, and I have continued to be here for the last 32 years. When Mr. Sam spoke to me a few weeks ago, requesting me to do this session, I readily agreed, of course, but then I was later on thinking about what I should be talking about, because over these 3 decades of my leadership journey here, I have shared several of my experiences already in many forums, in many seminars, in many conferences. So what is there to talk about? What more is there? That's one thought that I had. Then it struck me that leadership is a developmental journey, right? It is not something that you learn overnight or you finish learning at any point of time. It is an ongoing thing. It goes on, and at every phase, every stage, we keep learning. So I said, okay, I mean, there's definitely a lot more that I can share with you. And of course, because of that thought, I said to myself, look, I'm not going to make it a routine kind of thing. Let me, seriously prepare. All right. So I have prepared, I have referred to books, I have referred to journals because I wanted to make it a significant kind of contribution. Now, the other thought that struck me was, well, leadership is not always a joyous one, right? Many of us would say, well, my journey has been absolutely, peaceful. My colleagues have always cooperated with me. I've had a wonderful stint as a leader, so on and so forth. I don't know whether we can really say that ever, because leadership always comes with a lot of difficult moments, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. It is a painful journey. I think all of us would agree with me there. But despite all of this, we look at some kind of satisfaction, self-realization, self-actualization, so on and so forth. Because I always tell my colleagues, my leaders, if you're a leader, if you want to be a good leader, you should be prepared to go one step more than what your colleagues are doing, which means you will have to sacrifice a little more, right? That is absolutely required. So that's why I'm saying sometimes you may feel that you're doing more than what you probably would want to do, but that's a given. You will have to understand that. That's why I would like to start with this beautiful metaphor. Many of you may be familiar with this Greek mythical hero, Sisyphus. Now, he managed to deceive Hades, god of death, not once but twice. So he was punished by Zeus. And the punishment was this, that he has to roll a boulder up, push it up the hill. And once he reaches the top, the stone comes tumbling down. He has to come down again, start the whole journey again, reach the top, the stone comes down again. He has to come back. So this is a journey that he is compelled or cursed to take, right? It's a punishment for him. But for us as leaders, we do not look at it as a punishment, despite the kind of difficulties and pain and suffering that we may have to go through. Because for me in this story, although many people look at this, myth as something that indicates futility, right? I would like to look at it in a different way. When Sisyphus comes down the hill to pick the boulder once again up, there is this realization that happens. The fact that he needs to accept the situation and continue to do that joyfully, happily. Now, that's how, as leaders, I think we need to look at the whole thing. That's the message that this, has for me. The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. So let me begin with that, understanding that it is a painful journey. It is a difficult journey. And yet, we will have to continue this journey, right? For us to be self-realized, self-actualization, so many things that I just mentioned a little while ago. Now, when we talk about university leadership, of course, when I say university, I use the term university because I want to contextualize this because we all belong to the university setup. But you can take this to other, spaces as well, higher educational institutions. Now, when we want to make things better, the first thing that we should be doing is to be aware of the weaknesses. Where do we go wrong? Where can we improve? And for this, we really need to do a deep self-introspection, right? Because unless you know where you are, what your mistakes are, you're not going to improve, right? And in general, we all know our university education in India, right, especially state, central universities. Of course, the private universities may be doing slightly better, but still, there's a long way to go for us as well. But in general, all the universities, they have their own problems, right? I mean, especially in the last couple of decades, we have seen the kind of politics-filled, hateful, divisive kind of agenda that's going on in university campuses. Not only students, even faculty members are completely polarized. And the kind of hegemonic systems, that we have in university campuses re-entering, re-emerging in a very, very strong way. Now, we need to be aware. The point that I'm trying to drive home is we cannot insulate ourselves. We cannot distance ourselves from what is happening around us. This is something that we really need to be aware of. And only then we can actually positively contribute to bettering our own system. So what is required is a kind of restructuring, revamping, rethinking, revisiting even our own practices. We should be willing to do that because change is what is absolutely important for a leader. Always willing to adapt, always willing to change, and so on. Now, another thing I want to talk about as a leader, I may be in charge of a school, but then as a leader who belongs to a system, to a university, I should be affected by everything that is not happening right? I mean, when I'm in my office, classes are going on. So during class hours, we find students, trooping in, making so much noise, disturbing other classes. I should be affected. I cannot say, well, somebody else's job, the security will do it. No, right? Similarly, when the security himself makes a mistake, right, comes with his walkie-talkie blaring, right? I should tell him. I should stop him. I haven't seen many of us doing that. That's why I'm saying. So when I say quality in educational institutions or universities or colleges, it's total quality that we're looking at. Unfortunately, in many institutions, we focus only on academic quality. We expect teachers to improve their academic quality, but what about the other systems in place? Now, these are things that we will have to reflect upon because at times it pains me, to be very honest, because I come quite early in the morning, right? 8:15, I'm here. And when I go to park my car, I get, my BP actually goes up almost every day, right? The reason is we are not utilizing the space that's available. In fact, we have a campus which is huge enough to accommodate so many requirements. But then because of something that had happened a few years ago, we still don't want to change. I'll give you one example. This is the picture that I had taken in 2019, right? And I had spoken to the chief security officer. I told him, look, how are we using this space? It's abuse. Easily you can park 4 cars. Now some of you may ask me, why are you talking about, you're the dean of a school. No, this is important. That's why I said total quality. 2019, I told him, he said, we'll do. 2022, right? It pains me. And when I see some of our teachers doing this, parking like this, I tell them, I mean, look at it. Why can't you, give some space to another person? Some of them are quite generous that way. They agree, yes, sir, you're right. And then they change. Some others, they know, sir, the rule. You have to park, there between the 2 lines. This is where leadership comes in. How are we thinking? Are we going all the time by the rule book? Where do we change? How can we change? These are things that we will have to think about. This is just one example, right? And I'm giving this example because all of us are aware of this problem, right? So are we willing to change? Are we willing to adapt? That's a question. So for this session, I thought I will primarily refer to these 2 books, right? Some of you may have read, right? Pankaj Chandra's Building Universities That Matter. Where are Indian institutions going wrong? And of course, the other one, the idea of a university by Purvanand. The first one, Building Universities That Matter, that was published in 2017. I think many of you know who Pankaj Chandra is. I mean, he was the director of IIM Bangalore for some time. Then he became the vice chancellor of Ahmedabad University. He's an educationist, right? And the other one, of course, Purvanand, is a professor in the Delhi University, right? So both are very, very recent publications, 2017 and 2018. And of course, I did refer to some articles as well because I wanted this to be very authentic, right? It's not something that I'm going to cook up, right? I mean, it is very, very authentic. It is based on research works, right? So I will be largely using these books and articles, for this presentation. Now, let me begin with this simple question. I'm sure, all of us have spoken about this very often in our classrooms, with our students, with our peers, and so on, right? What is education? And for me, more than that, what is the higher in higher education, right? Don't you think we should all be asking this question? If we need to actually say we are in a space that's called higher education, there has to be a distinction between primary education, secondary education, higher secondary education, and higher education or tertiary education. Because for me, it is about moving from dependence to independence at one level. And everything that we want to impart here has to be of a higher order, whether it's in terms of skills, whether it's in terms of knowledge, whatever it is, right, of a higher order. Otherwise, we cannot call universities as higher educational spaces, right? That word higher is very, very significant. So it's a paradigm shift, actually, that we're looking at. It's a radical movement from the basic to the advanced, right? So what are those distinctions that we are talking about when we say basic and advanced? And that is why, for me, the quote that I had used in the brochure also, right, is very, very important. It is not a preparation for life. This is, something that we all are fond of, using. Education is a preparation for life. But let's look at it this way, right? John Dewey very categorically says it is life itself. That is how you live your life. What you learn there, that is life. What you practice there, that is life. It is not for something else. Education is not a means, for you to achieve something. It is the end. So what kind of education are we going to give? Generally, we talk about two important things, private good and public good, right? Unfortunately, in today's education system, throughout the world, it is the private good that has taken over and not the public good. Now, what do I mean by that? The private good is about improving one's own self, especially in terms of getting a job, getting a fat salary, improving your bank balance, right? Materialistic kind of things, right? And you call yourself successful, you call yourself happy, fine. I'm deliberately using that word, you call yourself, because that's your notion of success and so on. But the public good is largely ignored, right? So that is what we as educational institutions, academicians, leaders who belong to the system should be able to help our students with. How are they going to realize this public good? How are they going to contribute to that public good? I will come to that a little bit later. Now, the purpose, when we talk about three broad purposes we talk about, right? Now, the first one is we say they have to be enlightened citizens, right? And what do we mean by that? Enlightenment. Of course, it means that they understand, how they're supposed to conduct themselves in public life, right? The constitutional obligation, for instance, respecting the laws of the land, high regard for freedom for others, and high desire for peace. All of these things, go into that. Enlightened citizens. This is one basic purpose of education. I'm sure there's no difference of opinion. The second one is prepare for livelihood. Important, no doubt about it, right? We're supposed to, help them with that. And unfortunately, this has dominated. This is given more importance by everybody almost, including our own selves as parents, right? When we go to a school or a college, not a school, college, right? We always ask this question, what is your placement record, right? And we, on the other hand, we also say universities cannot be placement agencies, right? So what is the kind of focus that we can give to such things? And the last one, since I belong to this stream, humanities, for me, this is more important and more important than anything else, right? That is self-discovery, right? This is almost like saying, look, this is what you are. This is the meaning, for your existence. This is the meaning of your life, right? Although it might sound very philosophical, let me tell you, it's possible for students to find their own, ways, right? Who they are, understanding their own strengths, their weaknesses, and then moving on from that. See, a good education should help them, realize who they are. Are we, creating such avenues and so on? Basically, it's about their relationship with the world, how they are able to connect with the world. And when I say the world, the immediate world, for instance, I always give this example to my colleagues, holistic education that we have. We talk about personal skills, interpersonal skills, societal skills, and so on. This is all about relationship. How am I able to relate myself to myself, right? There is an inner being. That is personal, interpersonal with my peers, with my colleagues, and society outside, the larger, picture that we have to take into account. So this relationship is what is absolutely important. How are we able to relate to ourselves, to the world outside, the immediate world, and the larger world, right? So this is broadly, I think, the three purposes. I'm sure, you have no difference of opinion here because everybody, would say, well, these are the important things. Of course, you may say this is more important than the others and so on. The difference or the, argument may come there, but not with regard to the three purposes themselves. Right. Now, I want to talk about these two convocation addresses. Very interesting, convocation addresses. I have picked up this, from Purvan's book. In 1931, right, C.V. Raman spoke at Allahabad University. And the gist of that talk is this. He cautions students against the lure of the political. He says, don't get carried away. And he suggested that universities should act as brakes. For me, that is very, very problematic, right? They should act as brakes. On the other hand, you have another person, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan at Lucknow University, another convocation address. He exhorts students to become torchbearers of revolution, right? Because according to him, only that can wipe out the redundant and the decadent, according to him. And in fact, very clearly he says, if somebody is not prepared to do this, please don't come to university, right? Very categorical. And I want to quote, this is a very interesting quote. He says, universities are nurseries of youthful courage and excitement, not places where they are turned into slaves of tradition and social customs, make them into careerists, selfish and docile, making their thoughts rigid and rob them of their power to move forward. Very, very strong sentiments that he expresses here. So two convocation addresses around the same time in two different universities by two different people. Look at the line of thinking. What is best for universities? What kind of students are we going to create? I'm rather afraid of using the word produce, right? So that's why I'm saying create, right? So what is the mechanism that we're going to follow, right? So how do we achieve this in our universities? And when I look at this, it's not easy because these are the common problems that we see in all universities. Lack of collective leadership, right? And lack of systems thinking approach. To a large extent, it's person-based. Lack of humanistic principles being practiced. And there's no emphasis on self-leadership. There's no emphasis on socially responsible leadership. And in many cases, it's emphasis to place profit over people. These are the general kind of problems that we see in most universities, most educational institutions, right? So what kind of, interventions can we make as leaders, right? That is where I was thinking of the humanistic, element. When I say humanistic, well, start from the basic: human, humane, humanistic, humanitarian. I mean, you can go on and on. So many words, that you can think of, which are associated with a basic thing, right? Human, non-human, inhuman, right? There are so many ways. So all our practices, we will have to look at within this framework. Basically, humanistic principles, when I say, the emphasis is on social conscience, right? Number one. Second one, an independent spirit. And third, pursuit of truth. Fourth, a quest for knowledge. Fifth, creativity and freedom. These are the basic principles that I'm trying to incorporate here into this, framework. When I say humanism, humanistic principles, humanistic leadership, so on and so forth, because we have hundreds of leadership styles. I'm sure we've heard from our own colleagues, the different styles, that one can practice. But then I'm looking at everything in a synergical, way. I mean, there are many things that, will, the things that I'm going to share with, some of these things may come, in the other, leadership styles as well. But then I'm trying to synergize all of these. So more than analysis, it's synthesis that I'm looking at. Now, when we say these are the important qualities of a humanistic leader, because all leaders, have vision, right? Everybody has a kind of vision. But then, how is this vision shared? How is this vision, made an influence, of, when you transfer the vision? What is the method? What is the approach? How do your colleagues take it? And how do they respond to this vision? These are very important things, right? So it's more to do with how exactly are you going to do it, transferring that vision in a way that is accepted. That's why I say influence. So a leader has to be a humanistic leader, should have the vision, and should also know how to transfer in a way that the other person does not feel that as being intrusive, right? It's not difficult. I mean, it's not easy, right? But then we have to learn. So that's why influencer, a humanistic leader will have to be influencer, not somebody who always comes down using his authority or their authority, because that gender-sensitive language also I should be careful about, right? So, using their authority. And they should be enabling, right? Enabling atmosphere we need to create. And making and creative meaning. This is very important. I mean, if somebody tells you, look, you got to do this, you need to be able to tell that person, look, this is the reason. This is how, we make meaning. I mean, if the person is not convinced, right, why they should be doing that, you can never make them do that, right? How do you create meaning? How do you make them understand equanimity and level-headedness, right? Because sometimes we see that. I mean, the moment, people get power, things go haywire, right? You don't know how to handle, that power. Suddenly it comes to you and you go berserk, right? It can happen. In fact, Pankaj Chandra talks about these three qualities: vision, courage, and capabilities for the execution of decisions. According to him, these are the three important qualities of a leader. And for me, when I was reflecting on that, I said, I mean, okay, you may have that, but then there are people who work with you, right? And unless you empower them, Unless you give them that kind of freedom, this transfer is not going to happen, right? Empowerment is also very important. That's, of course, my addition, right? I'm going to spend a little time on this. There are lots of my colleagues here from management field. They may not like it, but nevertheless, I need to share this because the general misconception that we have about leadership is that it is management, right? Management is not leadership. That's something that we have to understand. The myth has to be busted. The reason why I'm saying this is you take our own leadership workshops. How many people come from the corporate world? How many people come from management background? How many people come from other backgrounds? That itself very clearly shows that we have a misconceived notion, right? So management for me is holding on to authority. Leadership is about letting it go. Only when you let it go, you will be able to lead. Otherwise, you will always manage, right? Status quo will continue. No creation, no innovation, nothing. So, management per se is not bad, right? I'm not saying, that we should not consider them at all. In fact, Pankaj Chandra is also a management, guru in that sense. I have still, taken, insightful ideas from him. But then not all management gurus are like that, right? So we must take what is required, yes. We must be aware of its limitations, very important. And in academics, we need to make the distinction because we are not an industry. Please remember. We are a university. All universities have to keep that in mind. We cannot work like industries or factories, right? We are dealing with equals. This is a very important distinction I always make. I'm dealing with Shobna, right, who is the head of the department. What is the difference? We're all equal. The only difference is that I hold a different position, a different responsibility. Tomorrow she will be there, right? So the way I deal with my colleagues, that's very, very important, right? So let's not look at management alone. And in fact, because I didn't want to be, considered as being not authentic, I have taken, quite a lot of quotes. I'm sure my management, friends will agree with me, right? Now look at that, management programs. One person, Mintzberg, says, teach only functional, technical, analytical skills. And that's usually good for the first position that they, get. But beyond that, it cannot help. And then the other one, many business schools claim that they're developing leaders, but their real focus is on the qualitative analysis, functional and technical skills. That's all right? And the last one, maybe indoctrinated with ideas that cause more harm than good, right? These are all management professionals, by the way, right? So I'm not alone in my thinking, right? And the last, quote that I want to share about management, there's a very interesting quote. Very quickly we'll read that, right? It's very interesting. Let me see if I can capture this in a nutshell. You walk through the foyer of the business school and look at these young people, heavily steeped in statistics and marketing and other technical, logical, problem-solving stuff. What that means is they are perfectly qualified to be managers. Managers solve problems 12 hours a day and keep the existing system in equilibrium. Managers preserve value, but our language around the business school is we're teaching leadership. They are hopelessly disqualified for that because leadership is not about problem solving, it's about purpose finding. It's about making a mess of and distorting the order that exists and bringing about a new order. How many of us would be willing to do that? That is a question. But for me, this is very significant because it's not about problem solving. Leadership is not about problem solving. Managers can do that. You have to be somebody who finds purpose for you, for everybody else, right? So my point is, therefore, there is a need for us to look at humanization of education, right? So how do we do that? We must go beyond the technical, definitely. I always say my favorite, phrases, as many of my colleagues would have heard this so many times. We don't want intellectual robots here, right? We want people. We want people who can relate to others, think with others, work with others, understand others, with compassion. Father Abraham, when he took over, he spoke about the happiness quotient, for instance, right? I mean, how do we establish that? How do we bring that in? The thought itself for me, is very, very important, right? When leaders have that kind of thinking, I'm sure, a lot of changes can be brought about, right? So a holistic approach is what we're looking at. And interestingly, I found another management professional saying this. Ed Freeman, for instance, he says that he is planning to create a leadership, in the creative arts. Shobna would like it, right? So you teach leadership through music, theater, art, literature. Possible. But we don't think on those lines. It's always through the management, principle. Management itself can be taught, this way. Leadership can be taught this way. So the point is we have to go beyond the industrial model. It's time, right? And I think we can do that, right? And another interesting person, Sisodia, who's a co-founder of the conscious capitalist movement, he says, first ask yourself, what is your purpose? Right? And that purpose has to align with the society. Because as an institution, it is not just providing what the students need, serving the needs of business or the students. It is going beyond that. Right? Doing something that is positive for the world. That is the purpose of a university. That is the idea of a university. That is the idea of humanizing, education and so on. Now, how to achieve this? Of course, self-leadership, I spoke about all this. But some of the things that we can seriously look at, one, of course, is decentralization. Of course, we talk about decentralization often. But to what extent are we practicing it? All universities, all educational spaces. Because I tell you, in many cases, decentralization doesn't happen because there's lack of trust. Lack of trust. You think about it. Why we don't want to do certain things, decentralized. Why I don't want to give power. Why I don't want to give authority to somebody else. Because I don't trust. I don't believe that the other person can do a good job. Or maybe I think he or she will abuse it. Right? And I tell you, when decentralization in the real sense happens, there is more ownership. There is more ownership. You will begin to own the entire system. And it also will help people becoming more and more responsible. Accountability will increase. And we need to give more autonomy. Now, currently, what we see, unfortunately, in many universities is the tragedy of standardization. Right? Uniformity. Irrespective of the disciplines. Forgetting completely that each discipline has a different kind of orientation, different kind of purpose. Now, that is not what university education should be looking at. Because for me, scholarship is about testing the unknown. I'm sure a lot of you would agree with me. It's about testing the unknown, and it's about experimentation. And as university leaders, we should be able to, give that kind of scope for all of our students and other colleagues, right? Because otherwise, when we don't do this, what will happen is control gains. And control can only create uniformity, nothing else. And when that happens, institutions with low autonomy, let me tell you, will change very, very slowly and very little. Institutions with low autonomy will change very, very slowly. And more importantly and worse, I would say, is the mediocre will define and determine the culture of the university. That's a very, very dangerous thing, right? So standardization, as far as possible, we should be avoiding. We should respect the disciplinary differences, right? And uniformity, we must try and avoid. Standardization, we must try and avoid. Flexibility, that's another thing we have to strongly think about. Because once you have that flexibility, then communication will happen on trust, based on trust. This is, in fact, Pankaj Chandra talks about it in a very detailed way. Lack of trust is what is ruining many of our institutions, he says, which is very true, I would say. Lack of trust. right? Because something happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? We always rely on past experience so much. Things are changing so rapidly. People are changing. I'm not the same person that I was 10 years ago. You're not. Students are not. Those days we remember, students used to have a wonderful kind of rapport with us, right? It was transformational, I would say. Today it's all transactional. You pay me, right? I do this service. Depending on the service that you give, I'm going to pay you. It's all business, right? It's a deal. So let's understand this, that there are things that are changing. Whether you like it or not, we're going to change. Things are going to change. So what I'm saying is, therefore, trust is very important. Emphasis on trust. And when you give emphasis on trust and the humane, meaningful work culture will automatically follow. You don't have to create a meaningful work culture. When these things are put in place, meaningful work culture will, happen, right? And also follow systems thinking. Because if you're not going to follow systems thinking, let me tell you, you will have only short-term fixes, temporary solutions. And these problems will continue. We're just postponing the problems, right? We're not finding solutions to problems. Yes, and of course, these are things that will have to happen if you want to have humanistic leadership style and institutions, right? These are all preconditions. We must have self-aware leaders. We must find experience in joy in experience. Experience of joy in work, off work as well, right? I've put both the prepositions. And leadership has to be collective. People will have to be given importance than other things. And the last four things, wisdom-based approach. This I would like to spend a few minutes on. Wisdom-based approach, which consists of moral imagination, systems thinking, and aesthetic sensibility, and all for the greater good, right? This is by Vadok. Okay, now very quickly I'm going to run through this. Moral imagination. Now what I mean by moral imagination, I have taken this from, these articles, right? So for moral imagination, the definition is this: to see the ethical issues and consequences in a situation. Simple. How many of us, when we take decisions, look at these issues, ethical considerations, right? Emphasis on the soft subjects. I'm not really comfortable with the word soft, but since it's used, I'm using it here as well. Because ethics is a very, very important thing, right? In any kind of field, you must be talking about ethics. And when you talk about issues, when you take decisions, all of these, should be considered. For instance, social, cultural, and ecological realities. You cannot take decisions in a vacuum, right? Keeping all these things aside. This is what moral imagination means. And this comes in a wisdom-based approach. And we must encourage reflective practices, right? Reflective practices. Now, what does that mean? For instance, today we talk so much about mindfulness exercises, practices, so on and so forth. These are things that can help us, look at things in a reflective, in a deep meditative way, and so on. Incorporate, humanities and creative arts into leadership thinking. And we have to develop the person as a whole. We have to look at people as a whole, not in fragments, right? So that's the whole idea of moral imagination, a conscious kind of approach to all of these things. The second thing is systems understanding, and the definition according to Senge is realistic and holistic perspective on the situation. Realistic and holistic. So again, not looking at things in fragments, not in parts, but the whole, right? And we have to recognize the complexity and interconnectedness and interdependentness of elements in the whole. This is systems understanding. And then building leaders who can look at, all of these things in a forward-looking way, right? And not just rely on past experiences. I just spoke about that, right? Because something helped us 10 years ago. Something was successful 10 years ago. Let's follow that, right? I always tell my colleagues, today you go to a class, you may, be a hero in your class today. Everybody liked it. Tomorrow you go to the same class. You follow the same pedagogy. You may be a total failure, right? So what happens then? I mean, we need to be able to adapt to different situations because people are not the same. People are so different. Every day we're changing. Our thinking changes. So foster creativity and curiosity. So don't blindly rely on past experiences, so on and so forth, right? Aesthetic sensibility, the last one, and this is the ability to see and assess the design and aesthetic issues and consequences in a situation in the service of the greater good. This is what is very important for me, right? Looking at all of these things in the service of the greater good. So design thinking, creativity, holistic thinking, intersection of leadership issues with aesthetic ones. You should be able to incorporate that. Because what is important here is collaboration, cooperation, and the treatment of people as ends rather than as means towards some economic or market-based end. Right? So these are the important elements of humanistic leadership in terms of qualities, in terms of what we can try and incorporate in our own system, in our own practices, and in general, the other educational spaces as well. Now, there's a quote that I would like to end with. It's a recent article that was sent by one of my colleagues, and when I read this, I found this very interesting. This is how the piece ends, and the title of the piece is "Hopeful Manifesto for a More Humane Academia." All right, and it goes like this: the Quakers were saying, "Let your life speak." Right? I stay because academia lets me live my values, to research purposefully, to engage respectfully, to teach ideas that center understanding and compassion, to speak publicly on issues that matter. It reminds me that each choice speaks. Our silences do too. A better academia is possible if we live it. So this is how that piece ends, which really struck a very, very positive note and a very strong note, in me when I read that. And the title is also interesting, A Hopeful Manifesto for a More Humane Academia. Now, in brief, yes, these are the things that we need to keep in mind, not just as leaders of Christ University, because today some of us are here, tomorrow some of us may be in other universities, because that, transition will always happen wherever we are. Now, this is something that we need to look at. In fact, I have a beautiful song. Do we have time, Sam? 10 more minutes, okay. It's a song that was written by Supertramp. I know how many of you have listened, because I'm talking about, education and leadership, through, humanities, arts, and so on. If I don't use a song, that won't look nice, right? So, this is called the Logical Song. Has anyone heard this before? No? Okay, chauvinist, yeah, right. The title is The Logical Song, and by the way, this was written in 1979, right? Almost 43 years ago, right? And it still holds good. Whatever, he was complaining about. It's a strong indictment of the kind of education system that was practiced, of course, in the UK, especially when we talk about higher learning, right? That is what we should be focusing on more than some of the other things that, unfortunately, today, worldwide, we've fallen prey to, right? So in that sense, I think this is a very, very interesting song. I thought that I must share with you because what he wrote 43 years ago still holds good, right? So thank you for your patient listening. And I know we've run out of time. Very quickly, if you can complete. Thank you so much.